just, there's a little delay on YouTube usually, so I'll just make sure we're live. I think it's a couple of seconds. And yes, we're live. So, hello everyone, and welcome to the 11th now episode of the Armory Roundtable. Today we move a little out of my comfort zone, at least. Hopefully for a good reason, because we're going to look at Chinese swords, weapons, and history. And with Keith Seeley, who you can see here also on the live. And Keith, if you want to introduce yourself a little and tell us about yourself and your background, that would be super cool.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. Otherwise, I just become the mystery bald man, right? So
sounds interesting, though.
Yeah. No, so my name's Keith. Starting way back in like 2012 or 13, right when I was coming out of high school, I was aware of HEMA, right? And I saw HEMA on the internet, on YouTube. You know, I was a super early subscriber to Matt Easton and Scala Gladiatoria, and then Schologrim and all them, of course, the greats, you know. But whenever I went to university, I was like, well, what am I going to do, right? And eventually I ended up settling on Chinese history. And pretty early on as well, as early as like 2013, 14, I discovered that there were Chinese documents or sources that also talk about martial arts and these types of things. And since that time, I gained the requisite historical and linguistic ability to access those sources and actually try and utilize them. And on the way there, I've also learned and studied a whole lot about swords in general and metallurgy and these types of things. I'm by no means an expert when it comes to metallurgy, but here we are. You know, you pick it up as you go in some sense. But you know, that's kind of my path, and that's So a little over 12 years is probably the amount of time I've been really working towards this goal. And so that's
cool.
Kind of
and background. So how did you get into Chinese history specifically then? What was the kind of trigger?
That's a great question. So it has to do with a study abroad opportunity. So my freshman year of university, I had the chance to study abroad and go to China. I went to Dalian in northeastern China. That's when I knew no Chinese. I knew like nothing about anything really. I was just a very young guy, but that was a great way to learn. And from that point, I was like, okay, well, maybe I'll do this Chinese history thing, because I had already had some interest in Chinese martial arts, just doing a little bit of like Kung Fu and Jeet Kune Do with some family, some like my uncle and things like that. And then I was like, okay, I'll just go full time into this. I'll just see how far I can get, basically. So.
Cool. So you already started, had you started with HEMA and European martial arts before you transitioned to the Chinese version, or did you just kind of have an interest and then?
Well, so initially when I was younger, I was much more interested in unarmed martial arts. And that's when I did a little bit of the Chinese martial arts. And I also, in university, I did some judo, and I've still done some judo. I still love judo. But I really started to get more interest in weapons as time went on. And initially, a lot of my, getting really into weapons actually was with HEMA and not with the Chinese weapons. I had done some Chinese weapons stuff, but at first, as far as like the sparring and some of your basic fencing principles and things, I did mostly some military saber, in no small part due to thanks to Matt Easton, right? And because I love that guy. But yeah, I did some military saber and sharpened my teeth a little bit. And then later on, I was like, okay, well, let me just like try out the Chinese weapons and see if I can unlearn things that I knew, or if like, what are the differences between these systems and how do they really work and things like that. But yeah, so that's kind of how I got here.
Okay, so yeah, I think Matt is probably responsible for 80% of people getting interested in well, swords in general, but I think saber a lot too. So okay, you mentioned. I mean, we'll dive into. I was thinking of starting from the general and going into the specific, but now that you already mentioned the differences between, let's say, unlearning
Yeah, I shouldn't have said
European.
anything.
Hmm? I'll just take hints where I leave them and then
Yeah.
try and latch onto them. So the need you mentioned to unlearn, let's say, the techniques I'd learned to actually be able to apply the Chinese ones. How different are the schools of thought and practice? Like, how drastic is that difference in your experience?
Well, I mean, the transition from like military saber to a Chinese weapon is going to be bigger than I would say the transition from like a messer to a
Mhm.
dao, right? Because in many ways, the Chinese systems are much more akin to the medieval systems than they are to the later systems. So the biggest differences I would say is probably the footwork, right? In military
Mhm.
saber, you want to be very profiled. It's all based on the lunge, starting with, it dates back really to rapier and goes forward and influences saber and work later, right?
Mhm.
So you're much more bladed and all those types of things. In the Chinese doll stuff, much more square footwork. You have a lot of things going on with your hips as far as like cutting mechanics and things. And the kind of military saber that I had been practicing was, English, Anglo, like English and American, and
Mhm.
it's like also influenced by French military saber, of course. But a lot of the Molinets are powered, or they're going around with the wrist and using the fingers and stuff. And in Chinese Dao, you're using everything. Like
Mhm.
sometimes it's your hips, sometimes it's your upper body rotation and your shoulders and your elbow, and just everything's going at once, kind of. You do have these kind of wrist motions, but the other big movers are really playing in as well. So that's kind of a basic difference would be, yeah, that.
Okay.
So.
So then, before we actually get into the specifics, maybe let's start for a complete beginner, as I would be in this case. What would the, let's say, broad timeline of Chinese weapons be? Let's say if you had to.
Yes, yes. Okay. Yeah, so yeah. If we're talking, are we talking about the systems or the weapons themselves? Because those are separate
Maybe both.
questions.
Maybe we can start. I don't know which one makes more sense to start with.
Yeah,
Probably the
yeah. Okay.
weapons.
Well, we start at the beginning with the weapons because we know about the weapons much earlier than we know about the systems because the systems are
Hmm.
obviously a much more intangible thing. Um, as far as weapons goes, you know, as early as 1000 BC or BCE, however you want to say it, we have Dao and Jian kind of already floating around, and they start to become more prominent and diverge more in towards the Warring States period. I'm really simplifying here, but you have bronze weapons, and they have the Jian is predominant, is the main
Hmm.
bronze, what we would say is sword, right? The main bronze sword is the Jian, which means it's a double-edged sword. The single-edged Dao as a sword was just a knife. It hadn't really became what we label a sword yet in the Bronze Age.
Hmm.
Now, the Warring States period in China is going to be like let's say the fourth and third centuries BCE, right? And then with the unification with the first emperor and then the Han Dynasty, which is roughly equivalent to Roman times, we have uh, standardization and a transition to steel. So in some ways, China kind of skipped some of the Iron Age and they went straight from bronze
Hmm.
into steel very quickly. They didn't just do that much with iron swords. Um, at that time, there was a point in the Han Dynasty, in the late Western Han Dynasty. So I would say between 100 BC to, you know, 25 AD or so, where there was a switch from the double-edged straight sword being the predominant military sidearm to the single-edged straight sword being the predominant military sidearm. So they went from double-edged to single-edged swords. in the military as far as the standard issue weapon. And after that point, the dao, or the single-edged sword, continued all the way to the end as the predominant military sidearm, and also became, over time, it became the most common weapon among civilians, even though the Jin always was always there. It never faded away, but it was always there. It was omnipresent. Sometimes it would end up in the military in like officer weapons. Sometimes it would just be among the civilian population, but it always existed over that time. So just
Okay.
yeah,
So
that's the
this already
basic
opens a bunch of.
saber, or the swords. Yeah.
So already a bunch of questions pop to
Okay.
mind. So the first,
No,
let's
we can do
say,
whatever.
when we talk about kind of skipping of the Iron Age phase, let's
Yes,
say,
yes, that's a good question. Yes.
why would, like, what is, do we know why that happened? In the sense that, let's say, intuitively, you would think that obviously you would have to go through iron before you're able to then elaborate like the steel
Yeah,
production process.
that's a great question, and I'm not an expert in this, right? I'm not an archaeometallurgist, but I would kind of speculating here based off what I know. I would say there's a few reasons. Number one, the Bronze Age in China starts a little bit later than in the Near East and in,
Hmm.
like the Mediterranean, and this is in large part due to the isolation of Eastern Asia, right?
Hmm.
Because you have to, in order for, because bronze doesn't, it's not like it's, and bronze working is not something that just sprouted up in multiple places. It started in the Near East and spread to China. And in
Hmm.
order to get to China, it had to go through, upper in the through Central Asia and the Taklamakan Basin, like desert, all this other stuff. It made a long journey to get to this other sedentary civilization, and it
Hmm.
actually ended up passing through the steppe in some way and getting down in there as well. And iron, the same thing, right? So both bronze and iron working came to China and weren't just invented there. Now, there was an earlier train of thought that iron working also was indigenous to China.
Hmm.
Um, However, the most recent scholarship I've read suggests that it came from Central Asia as well.
Okay.
Now, so we're talking like, you know, 1600 to 1200 BCE is when bronze kind of first gets into China.
Hmm.
And then they kept working with that bronze, and China did a few unique things with it. In a lot of other parts of the world, they relied heavily on lost wax casting to create bronze implements. And they did that some in China, but they also really, really refined the piece mold casting. So they were able to do some really intricate piece mold casting and create massive. They quickly, even though they got bronze a little bit later, they quickly really had a large scale. So
Mm.
like I think I can't. I'm not going to quote the numbers, but one of the largest, or I think maybe the largest bronze object of the ancient world was actually a large Chinese like cauldron, and it was
Mm.
like a couple hundred kilograms or something. I'm not going to remember the specific number, but it's like a
Yeah,
massive piece of bronze.
I've
Um,
seen a few of them recently. There's an exhibition in the Netherlands about Asian bronze, and some of the pieces they have are really mind-blowing. Like when you see the
yeah,
age and the scale of things, it's shocking.
yeah, yeah. So China has this massive scale of bronze works. A lot of the bronze is being put into um, ritual vessels, which whatever that means, we can. That's a whole nother topic. But basically, it's a way legitimizing your state in some sense.
Hmm.
Now, weapons are the other aspect, right? So you have these ritual objects and you have weapons. As far as weapons go, China really likes this thing called the dagger axe. You basically get a knife and you turn it sideways and you grab people off a chariot, or people on chariots grab you. That's kind of the idea. Um,
So
Over time,
with the edge inside the.
yes, yes, the edge is
Yeah.
on the
Okay.
inside of the implement. Yeah. Um, Now, over time, the bronze work starts to get more and more sophisticated. So we start to eventually we have things like bimetallic alloy bronze weapons. So they'll like cast a core of a jian, let's say a double-edged sword. They'll cast a core with a different tin percentage than the edge piece. So they cast a core piece at maybe 10% tin content, and then they put it in another mold, a piece mold, with the edge hollowed out, and then they cast the edge onto it with has maybe 20% tin content, which is unusually high compared to other Bronze Age cultures in the world. And then sometimes they have a couple castings to create a handle on top of that core as well. So they start to do these really sophisticated things with their bronze later on, and have all these surface treatments as well. So
Because
the,
sorry, if I'm not mistaken, the in like European bronze objects, like the military grade, like the sword grade, is usually what, 11% tin or something like that, right?
yes,
10 to
yes,
12.
exactly. Mm-hmm.
So what effect does 20% have on the edge, if we know?
Yeah, that's the question that's the $1 million question that everyone wants to know the answer to. But we haven't done. I don't know if anybody. I know a couple people have replicated it in a couple papers that I've seen, but all this was done in China. And as far as I know, they were just seeing if they could recreate the process. They didn't do any testing to know what that actually does with the sword, right? But one thing I would love to know is how does a sword like that actually work? Because it wasn't just on these super elaborate swords. You have some super elaborate swords with this construction, but you can also have some very basic swords, and they call it the two color. It's a two-color sword because you can see the difference in patina, and based on tin content. The higher tin content's a little brighter or more silvery looking a lot of the time. So they call them the two-color, like shuangse jian, right? The two-color jian, and some of these seem to be very bare bones, just utilitarian weapons. They don't have any like turquoise inlays or anything like that. So the impact of that is an excellent question that I would love to know the answer to. Um, but going back to this bigger question, the general premise or the first point I would say is that the bronze arrived and grew to a large enough scale and became sophisticated enough where it could suit the needs of the state to mass produce weapons in a way that um, iron wasn't doing. And now let's talk about iron, because the other thing about China is that iron came in, and as most early iron was, it was bloomery or bloomery furnaces creating this iron, right? Which creates a product that's quite soft and has to be, hammered and folded and refined into a good steel. In China, they quickly, I think in large part due to the scale of the bronze work, that's just speculation on my part though. I would say this might be one of the reasons why they quickly switched to cast iron. So they had the blast furnace, and they were just melting the iron into cast iron. Now, if anybody knows anything about cast iron, it's not very good for weapons because its carbon content is very high and it's quite brittle. But what this did mean is that there was a time in Chinese history during the Warring States period where a farmer could be using a cast iron plow, and then if he gets conscripted to go to war, he picks up a bronze weapon and goes to fight, right? Or maybe a soldier has a belt hook made of cast iron, right? There's all these cast iron little implements and things that they had, but the cast iron wasn't really good. It didn't surpass the quality of the bronze that they were using. And eventually what happens is they scale up the processes for converting that cast iron into wrought iron and then mixing it together and creating nice steel. But something else is that early on is in the Han Dynasty, whenever they do make this transition, the Qing and Han Dynasty, they make this transition from bronze to like iron and steel, they already take the lamination or they were already basically doing this bimetallic bronze casting, and they just immediately kind of transition that onto lamination of iron swords.
Hmm.
So they already know, like, we'll get the hard stuff, put it on the edge, the soft stuff, put it in the core, right? So um, now I would love to talk to other people. I don't know of anyone who studies this particular topic much. It's Chinese archaeology and metallurgy is in a different place as far as what they value, but
Hmm.
um, but yes, there's a lot of work to be done on these bronze weapons and this early iron stuff and why and how that exact transition happens. It's an ongoing question in the field. So
I'm actually interested, curious about when you say they're in a different place in terms of what they value. This is one of those interesting topics because we all tend to think that our standards are kind of universal. It's like, oh,
yeah,
this is what is important, but then you quickly find out that's not the case. So, what are the big differences, let's say, in terms of the
yeah.
archaeological?
So it's as far as the state of archaeology in China in general, it's much has it's been practiced for a much shorter time than in the West. Um, so there've always been kind of antiques and antiquarian practice in China for as long as there's been an idea of China, right? That's been forever. But as far as going up and digging things out of the ground and methodologically, like seeing where they're at and things, that's only been being done for, I would say, the past, like seriously, for maybe the past 40, 50 years.
Hmm.
Now, some people might disagree with me. That's totally fine. They probably know better than me. But as far as I'm aware, most of the stuff that's really being unearthed and preserved well is coming in later, right?
Hmm.
Now, on top of that, um, a lot of them are really focused in on this question of where and how bronze and iron starts in China. So that's one of the big questions that they've done a lot of work on, which is somewhat connected, but like, did bronze work come from Central Asia or was it coming from China? Right, that's a huge question that they've done a lot of
Hmm.
work on. They also have done a lot of work on these ritual vessels because there's a lot of them, right? So in any historical pursuit, we can either be pushed by the sources available or by our ideological, um, like, intuition of what is
Hmm.
important, right? And in some sense, this is driven by the sources available. So um, there's a lot of these bronze implements. They want to understand them. They want to know what all of them are. So there's going to be a lot of work done on that, right?
Hmm.
And then there's this ideological or cultural implement or focus, which is, as far as ferrous or iron weapons or steel weapons goes, they don't really value them that much.
Hmm.
They're much more focused on bigger, you could argue more historically significant things. Because in the grand scheme of things, the the quality of one iron sword over another doesn't really matter that much
Yeah.
as things like, what is your capital like, or like your um, agricultural system, your
Yeah.
bureaucratic system, right? These are things that impact history in big ways more than the percentage of carbon content in the edge of your sword, right?
Yeah.
It's what we obsess over. So,
Which feels like it aligns a lot with what you were saying about the big scale of production. Like if each sword doesn't really help to tell much about, I don't know, the local production or differences, it's like, okay, fine, we have a bunch of them, but
yeah, yeah. But there
interesting.
are still interesting, there's a lot. And the other thing I would say is, like, um, it will change with time, I'm sure. And there's still there's this other issue in China, which is that the black market is still very much alive and running, and you can get fines that are not properly provenance, like we don't really know where they came from, and all these
Hmm.
other issues. Um, so things will get better with time. I also haven't seen anything akin to like battlefield archaeology happen in China yet. But I'm confident that with time it will happen, and we'll have our equivalents to those in Europe of all the finds of people with their skulls split into and things like that.
Yeah.
But
It's weird to hope for that. It's a bit morbid, but I get the
yeah,
the spirit.
but it's a
Um,
part of the past. It's a part of the past human experience, which means is worth studying in my book. So
exactly. Okay, so the metallurgy was the first point. The other question, closing a bunch of brackets. Sorry, I'm opening a lot of them. Let
no,
me
it's
know
okay.
when you lose
I'm
track.
just I love just going off. It's what this is all about. So
Cool. The other is the transition, let's say, from the double-edged sword to the single-edged sword.
yes, okay.
But maybe before we actually go into that, China is huge, of course, and has
Mhm.
a variety of, let's say, like huge regional and cultural differences.
Yes,
More so, I would imagine, in the past. Do we see that
yes,
reflected in early
definitely.
weapons?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. So good question. Um, yeah. So people who aren't as familiar with China might not realize the differences that exist, and it has become more homogenized over time. Um, Now, when we're talking about the Warring States period, they are literally completely different places. Like there is no sense of common relationship between these different states. Like they're as
Mm.
different as Japan from China as far as they're concerned, right? And they don't even know Japan really exists yet. But
Mhm.
but and also even today, linguistically, the dialects are they call them dialects only because they don't have their own navy or army or whatever, right? Have you ever heard that the only thing about a language is that it's a dialect with an army, right? So the the Chinese dialects are very true in that sense of the word. Is like
Okay.
they are many of them are completely mutually intelligible, right? They cannot necessarily communicate with each other, and in a different world, in a different historical trajectory, they could end up being different nations, right? That's not how
Mm.
things play out. But now you asked this question about weapons. Um, this is something that, unfortunately, I don't know as much as I would like to know, but there are definitely some things going on, right? We know that certain states like Yen and Chu were early adopters of iron technology, right? And they were also known as having some pretty sophisticated bronze stuff. A lot of the bronze stuff, though, the the earliest bronze jin start in this region called Wuyue, which is in southeastern China.
Mm.
So I should say also I mentioned Chu and Yen. Yen is in northern China, and Chu is in kind of how would you say it? It's a little bit southwestern, but not nowadays southwestern. China was a smaller
Mhm.
place back then, but so it'd be around Sichuan and this kind of region. Um, but yeah, we definitely have some differences going on. And but interestingly, the places that were renowned for their metallurgy are not the ones that won the grand strategy war, right? So
Interesting.
the Qing, the ones who actually won, are the ones who were the masters of bureaucracy. Um, so in the end, you can't contend. The wars are won on logistics. So as long as you can
Yeah.
keep putting the army out there every year and they can't keep fighting you, eventually you win, right? So
Which again goes to confirm what we were talking about before in terms of different interests, different archaeological interests. If
yeah.
the bureaucracy and the structure is what really made the state, that will probably be more
Yeah,
important.
yeah. So one more thing to add is that the cavalry. So cavalry
Mm.
also comes into China in the Warring States period is when it starts to become more important. Um, and of course, the early adopters of cavalry are the ones who are closer proximity to the steppe, right? Because that's where
Mhm.
the horses are and that's where the horse riders are. So um, they're the earlier adopters of cavalry. However, there's a few interesting things about horses in China. I made an entire video about this topic, but how you say it? China was never able to field they were never able to scale up their horse rearing into a level that they needed for the size of armies they had. They were always short of horses, and it's in part due to maybe cultural reasons of like how you take care of horses and animal husbandry, but it's also because the pasture land that they had in central China was already full-time agriculture. In addition to that, the soil lacks selenium, which is a necessary mineral for horses to have. So the horses raised in these areas would be poor. So China always had this dynamic with the steppe where there's this boundary zone between China proper and steppe proper, and whoever's controlling that region is basically either trying to raise horses to sell to China or maybe cut them off if China's not doing what they want, or it's China trying to control them and trying to make sure that no one from the steppe takes them away from them, right? So, so there's this boundary region in northern China where this is dynamic. It goes on from the Warring States period pretty much all the way through.
And I find this really interesting because when you think about resources and things, you don't imagine that such massive areas of land would not be able to support a specific resource. You usually think that somewhere in a huge subcontinent level mass, there will be a region, but that is not the case.
Well, I mean, it's not that they couldn't get horses, and they could get horses, they could get quality horses, but it's about the scale, right? So you think about like population estimates are always going to be rough, and the further back you go, the crazier they're going to get, like as far as reliability goes. But let's go later, like let's say it's the Ming dynasty, so the 14th century or something, or 15th century. They have a standing army of around 1 million soldiers, right? So now so they need hundreds of thousands of horses for their force, and they just can't produce that many in the space that they have. So, yeah. Meanwhile, on the steppe, they have like 6 horses per man. Like, they don't have enough people.
That's still true today, like the unequal distribution of resources.
Yeah.
Okay, so then at some point after the Warring States, I assume we have a bit of a more like homogenization, I guess, of weapon styles and things.
Yes. So the first emperor he unifies the script, he unifies the many things about just I would say like if you look at like the terracotta army, it's like that's the like the ideal image of what our military should look like, and when he died, right? In some sense. So they have fairly standardized weapons and armor and chariots, and it wasn't just the military, but they tried to standardize everything. So even the width of roads they tried to standardize it so they could have a certain axle length for their chariots, so they could go everywhere more conveniently. Yeah, so things like that. But
big empire problems.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and then we have this transition from a double-edged sword to the Dao. And when does that kind of come into play, and why?
Yeah, so now the exact date, like I can't give you any particular year of any military decree that's like, oh, we're switching, right? We don't have that. So, and we don't know exactly why, right? There's different theories. So it occurs, I'm pretty sure it occurs. So the Han Dynasty, at first they were too weak to directly contend with the Xiongnu, or what some might say are the Huns, right, on the steppe. and so they couldn't directly fight them until you get to this Emperor Han Wudi. Now Han Wudi does these massive campaigns, and they make some headway with fighting the steppe peoples, the Xiongnu. After he's gone, you have a short time with not as much conflict. It's still kind of ongoing, but then you get into like 80 BC, and a lot of warfare erupts once more. And as far as I know, sometime around there, or like the late Western Han Dynasty, is when this transition happens. Now, if anybody has more sources about that, I would love to see them. That's just my current read of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
But this is not the thing I've studied the most, right? I spent most of my time on other things. It happened sometime around this time. We don't know exactly why. So there's different theories, right? Some people would say that it's easier to train a soldier to use a single-edged weapon as opposed to a double-edged one. I'm not totally sold on that theory for different reasons. But another explanation would be that it's more durable to have a single-edged weapon, especially because some of these Han Dynasty Jin were very thin. That could be one explanation. It could also be about economics. It could be just much easier to mass produce weapons when they only have one edge, right? It could also be about something about the growing influence of cavalry. So the Han Dynasty over time gets more and more access to those North Chinese regions or Northern China regions that have pasture land, they have more horses, and cavalry warfare is continually evolving. Like if you go all the way back to that time period, they don't even have stirrups. So it's a lot harder to use a horse without those stirrups. But over time, after the Han Dynasty, they do get stirrups, and the role of cavalry over time, it becomes more powerful to a point until it starts to fade. But yeah, so the increased use of cavalry could mean that single-edged weapons are better, which is interesting to think about. But
okay, and then the other distinction you made was between, which kind of matches the use in military, this shift, but even with the use of civilian weapons. So what is let's say, what are the main points? Because a lot of times when we look at use in Europe, for example, we have a lot of laws against armed civilians, let's say, so at least with swords. So how is the civilians' relationship with the sword, let's say?
Yeah. So obviously, over the course of history, it's going to have massive changes, and there's still a lot that we don't know. Early on in the Han Dynasty, there was definitely a dueling culture with the Jin. And you also have this thing called the hook shield, which is in some ways equivalent to a parrying dagger. So you have this long, the Han Jin were also longer than the Jin of later periods. So you have these very long rapier-like Jin blades with these parrying dagger hook shields, right? So something, and there's a dueling culture that we see in people referencing in sources and things. Over time, that fades. We don't know exactly why. There was a lot of chaos after the fall of the Han Dynasty. You have the Three Kingdoms, and then you have the Northern Southern dynasties, and you have a lot of cultural shifts as well, like Buddhism starts to become very big and prominent in China after the Han Dynasty. In the Tang Dynasty, we have even less because they stopped talking about a lot of that stuff, and they stopped burying themselves with weapons. So we know very little about the Tang Dynasty. Going forward in the Song Dynasty, we can see that actually one of our good sources for this, I would say good in maybe in quotes, but is literature. So we have the Shui Hu Zhuan, or what's called like Outlaws of the Marsh, which is basically like Chinese version of Robin Hood, the Tales of Robin Hood, where it's like
Mm-hmm.
these folk heroes going on and getting into trouble and doing things they shouldn't probably. But the Dao plays a very significant role in their culture, the martial culture, the
Mm-hmm.
civilian martial culture of the time. And I've also read a paper which looks at one reason perhaps why the Tao is very prominent is because it can be modified, or that the thing about a Tao is that it's any single edge blade, right? It doesn't matter if it's a knife like this, a sword like this, or on a pole arm, right? It's all just called a Tao. And there's some indication that in the Song Dynasty, people would walk around with these like little choppers like this, and then when they get out of town, they would mount them on a stick
Mm.
and have a pole arm and be more secure on the road or whatever. Um, but it was a way to have a much bigger weapon in a smaller package just by taking the pins out or whatever. Um, so that could be a kind of legal uh, reason why they're favoring one weapon over another. But the over time in the Ming Dynasty, you uh, so I'm really oversimplifying. I'm going to keep saying that a lot because it's true. But at the beginning of the Ming Dynasty, you have hereditary professions. So every profession that you could ever be is a hereditary household. So if your dad was a basket weaver, you are a basket weaver. Like it's a law. Everybody in the entire empire was like that. The military was the same system. Eventually, that becomes ineffectual for kind of obvious reasons. It's just a bad idea. but whenever things really start breaking down in China, you always have peasant militias. And peasant militias in later Chinese history always ended up favoring the Dao. And this could also be in part due to what's called so-called conquest dynasties, where nomadic peoples found a dynasty in China. So the Ming, after the Yuan, so the Mongols come in and conquer China, and the Mongols, being who they are and their culture, they always use the Dao or the single-edged sword. Right. After that, it's pretty much fixed that the Dao is the standard among civilians and among the military most of the time. So
Interesting.
And that continues in civilian culture, including in like peasant militias or in like bodyguard agencies. So later, even in like the 1880s in China, you had if you were a merchant and you wanted to take your goods to another city far away, there was a lot of chaos and not a lot of central authority. So you would pay these agencies to be your bodyguards as you take your goods to another place. And they would have firearms, but they would also have some swords and things, and maybe a spear or something. And most of them would be using Dao.
So the double-edged, let's say I mean, by its nature, the pure weapon in a sense, like it can't be used for anything else, I guess, remains more of a status symbol, like officer's sword you mentioned, and it has maybe some slight returns.
Yeah. So in the Ming Dynasty, you do have some military generals who have a tian in their statues and things. Now, is that and I should say, we also do see some jian that appear to be militia weapons, right?
Okay.
But those aren't the same ones that people usually want to use because they're super beefy, clunky choppers. Not very elegant weapons, but very few militia weapons are elegant. I would just put it that way.
Yeah, makes sense.
So the jian is always there. Sometimes it's in the military. Another thing about the jian is that it's been associated with Taoist ritual for a very long time as well. And I'm going to blank on the earliest references that I found to this, but there are some early references to Jinn being used in exorcisms and things like way back into the Zhou dynasty. So like, the warring states in the spring and autumn period and things. And so you have, it's a lot of like magical spells, like to get rid of demons or like this kind of thing. They will use a Jinn. So the Jinn also serves this other ritual purpose, and that continues on through history as well. So that is one thing that kind of solidifies, I think it kind of solidifies the form of the Jinn in some ways, because the Jinn does not evolve nearly as much as the Dao. There are changes. There are definitely changes that occur. Sometimes it's broader, sometimes it's thinner, this. But the Dao, by contrast, it's like every imaginable shape that can exist does exist almost. And the Jinn is much more conservative in form. So.
Which actually is a perfect lead into the next question or topic, because every time I look at like breakdowns or graphs, and most of them are by Delatrix, by the way. So, so thank you for that, Andy.
Great.
Exactly. And in many of those, it's really interesting because you have this distinction between the Jin and the Dao, but then from a European perspective, let's say, it's really not that clarifying because, as you mentioned, within the Dao, there's all kinds of different shapes. And so, does this follow a sort of like the difference in shapes in the Dao? Does it follow a timeline? Does it follow regional differences? Or is it just people experimented a bunch without really kind of flow to it in a sense?
Yeah. So, let's see. Like from the Han Dynasty to the early, like the late Tang and right before the Song Dynasty, most handheld Dao, like single-handed. So let's say because Dao can refer to a single edge blade of any length and any handle length, right? Let's just simplify it really fast and say the ones that are held with one hand that have a blade of like above 60 centimeters, right? So from the Han Dynasty to the Tang Dynasty, they are fairly consistent in terms of being mostly straight, not always straight. Sometimes they're curved forward, actually, but mostly straight and have a ring pommel, right? Now, in the Song Dynasty.
Sorry, just when we're talking about dynasties, what's the timeline?
Yes,
So,
I'm sorry.
no, I'm
You know,
sorry. I should know more, but
being in the things that I studied, I just got this drilled into me. But so the Han Dynasty is gonna end in 280 AD, right?
okay.
280. Well, that's actually the Three Kingdoms, but it doesn't matter. Kind of around that time, all the way into, let's say, the end of the Tang Dynasty is going to be the late 10th century, or the beginning of the Song Dynasty is the late 10th century, basically.
Okay.
So 960. But the so around that whole span of time, most Dao, not all of them, but most of them, the single-handed over 60 centimeter blade are going to have a ring pommel. Some of them don't. They're almost always straight. They almost always have just there's some differences in where exactly the bevel is on the blade, but that doesn't matter too much. And yeah, there are some that have a slight double edge right at the tip, but it's still fairly standard. There's not too many drastic changes. Starting with the Song Dynasty, things really change. Now, first, there's this new kind of Dao that kind of comes out, and they even reference it in sources. They're like, we're going to do it like this new kind of like chopped point Dao or whatever. And basically, this Dao is very broad. It's very broad, and it has a clip point, and it's pronounced where the edge is longer than the spine. But it's also the clip isn't sharpened really. But so you have that type of Dao emerge, these very broad, choppy, falchion-like Dao. And then you also have increasing influence of the Central Asian curved sabers. And these things start to come together into contact with each other. They both start to become popular in different places, and eventually they fuse together in a sense. And
Is that when you get those? Sorry, is that where you get those Dao that look almost like the stereotypical cartoon, like the curved and the really wide
so
tip,
that
like
happens. Yeah, so those so there are some fashions or the quote unquote like scimitar looking
yeah,
doll earlier on, but the current one that you're probably imagining is a 19th century design.
okay,
So yeah, the like that's the oxtail or the Niuwei
yeah,
doll, the oxtail doll. That's a 19th century design. There are some sword designs that look similar to it earlier on. Whether or not they are similar is a different question, because the thing about the Niuwei doll is that it's distal taper. It has quite a bit of distal taper, so it gets quite thin at the end of the blade. Whereas I suspect that some of the earlier designs that look like a Niuwei doll are actually a little bit different in that they're probably thicker and intended for slightly different contexts. But yeah, so you have the Central Asian like Shamshir type blades,
yeah,
and you have these broad cutting blades from the Song Dynasty. They're mixing together. They're doing all the kinds of things, and then you also later on in the uh, mid early to mid 16th century, you have the importation of lots of Japanese swords into China,
okay,
and this also changes the dynamic. So if we're at so if we look in like let's say the year 1500, sometimes you can still find just the Central Asian swords floating around, right? You can find Japanese swords floating around, and you can find like mixtures of the two, or these Chinese swords that have design influences from multiple places. So,
which is interesting because isn't the Chinese like the straight double-edged sword the one that first influences Japanese swords, like
so,
the early ones with the straight?
so the Nihonto are a whole nother kettle
Yeah,
of fish. The Tang Dynasty straight blades definitely influenced the development of the tachi. Now, it wasn't
yeah, yeah.
everything. There was some other indigenous things going on in Japan, and particularly the curvature. Early Japanese tachi have a lot of curvature in the hilt, or like right around the hilt, and then the blade is mostly straight. So it's a very funky shape that's not very common. That type of curvature is found in earlier knives in Japan, and it's not something that appears that I have seen in China. But a
Okay.
lot of other elements of like hilt furniture and um, the blade geometry, some aspects of the blade geometry are very influenced by the Tang Dynasty straight blades. Yeah. But Japan undergoes its own history and own
Yeah.
things, and then some of these blades make it back into China. And it does what I think, interestingly, I think it makes discards mainstream on Chinese swords. Now, discards have been floating around for a long time, and there's other shapes that aren't disc-like. There's like a four petal, like the saber, right? It's like four lobes, a four-lobed, quadrilobed discard thing. That was in China for a long time, since like the 10th century, about. And but after that late Ming period, when the Japanese swords come back in, the discard becomes standard on almost all Dao. So, but all this is just talking about single-handed Dao over 60 centimeters in length. So, if we talk about the other ones, it gets even crazier. So, double-edged, or not double-edged, but two-handed Dao are very heavily influenced by Japanese weapons.
Okay.
So, before you can find a few random double hand or like two-handed dao. So we have to talk about proportions, right? Because it can also be a polearm. So if the handle is substantially shorter than the blade, that's what I will call a two-handed dao, right?
Mm-hmm.
So two-handed dao are quite uncommon, very uncommon in China until the late Ming, when the Japanese weapons come back in, and then they become popular again. Now, there are other things like, you could say, like a sword staff type of thing where the handle is about equal in proportion to the blade. These are in China, I would say from at least even the Tang Dynasty all the way to technically even in World War II, the Da Dao is also kind of fits into this category. So those have along like these like sword staff like things, whatever we want to call them. They call them big choppers or big dao in China, in Chinese. Very
understandably. It makes it very clear.
So, and let's think. The pole arms. So the pole arms, the ones with the very long handles, and then you have the blade at the end. In some sense, dao means blade and not just single-edged blade, because sometimes you have pole arms with multiple edges, but it's still called a dao. So, for example, the most extreme example is what's called the 三剑两刃刀. So it literally means the three-pointed double-edged dao. And it almost goes against the definition of dao, and according to almost all the other dao are not like that, but there's a few that are like that, which kind of makes the whole category a mess. And the basic idea is it's definitely not a jian. A jian is a very fixed thing in the conception of what a jian is. The dao is much more loose. And when you're talking about pole arms, the forms and shapes get even more extreme. And I think this is largely just because if you get a big stick and you put something on the end of it, it's not coming very close to you, hopefully. And you can make it kind of whatever shape you want and as many spikes or blades as you want. And yeah, basically, as long as it can just hits the other guy, it doesn't come close to you. It doesn't really matter how crazy it gets. So there's a lot more freedom with what you can do.
Yeah, and of course we see that in European polearms as well. The kind of wealth of variety is increases quite a bit. So linguistic differences, or better, linguistic challenges in terms of the definition of Dao, but also conceptual challenges in a sense. Like the Dao is technically, a blade. So then everything falls into this.
Yeah. It's a blade, but it's not a double-edged sword blade.
Yeah, exactly. So outside of the Dao, so when we thought we have double-edged sword blade, then we have the Dao, is there any other weapon category in traditional Chinese, or does everything fall in the Dao, apart from bows, I suppose? And
So,
weapons?
I mean, no, there's lots of other weapons. As far as cutting weapons, most of them are going to be dao or jian, right? Those are the main cutting implements. Except unless we're talking about like axes, right? Axes are also a separate category with fu. And sometimes you can have like earlier in the Han Dynasty, they had hewing spears, like the pi or the sha. Those are slightly different, but that term fades out over time. And of course you have spears and other piercing weapons, and you have other blunt weapons, right? But the main, if it's a cutting weapon, it's probably a dao or a jian.
Okay. So I have one question before I forget. When you mentioned the ring pommels, so that's something that I've seen in a call recently with Maxime Chenard as well. Irish swords, they're completely different, but it's just interesting to see So what is, if we know their function, why were they designed that way? And yeah, what can
Yeah.
you tell
Okay.
us
So
about it?
this is another topic I've made a couple videos on, and including another extensive blog post at one point. But basically, my argument would be that there is no one function, but that it kind of evolves to suit the context of the time, right?
Mm,
So the one distinguishing feature, as far as I'm aware, between most of the Chinese ring pommels and some of the Irish ones is that the tang is not through the ring, right?
yeah,
So it's a
exactly.
completely hollow ring. Now, there is evidence that sometimes it was used to hang weapons on the wall, which is a pretty useful function, right?
Yes.
Other times it could be used to tie a lanyard, which is another useful thing. Other times it's very clear it was super decorative, which wouldn't have been
Mhm.
very useful for anything except looking flashy because it's like intricately carved with like types of like mythological beasts inside it, and it's gilded, and it's like what else are you going to do with this thing? Like I wouldn't I wouldn't want to scratch it putting it on a post all the time, right? So it's like there's all these different things that it can do. Um, as far as like function in combat, I'm not too in favor of some interpretations that people have. Like, I've seen people say that you can like grip it or something, or yeah, I'm not too convinced by that. It
Mhm.
definitely does serve as some way to keep the sword from slipping out of your hand when you're casting it out or whatever.
Mhm.
So in that sense, it serves a basic function of holding on to it. But I'm not. I don't think it has any particular combat utility, and it could just be that it's an easy way to make a pommel on a sword. It doesn't. Yeah. So
Yeah.
and
Um,
we can see evidence for multiple different uses. So I would argue that over different times, it can be different things and different reasons why it exists. So
okay. And does this ring pommel, like, what's its history in the sense, is it always present on certain kinds of DAO, or is there a phase out?
it changes over time. At the earliest Dao, some of the earliest Dao that exist in China are bronze, like little bronze knives, and some of those already have it. So that's like 1,000 or 800
Mhm.
BC, right? They already have them, and it goes, and you can find Dao with ring pommel all the way into World War II with the Da
Okay.
Dao choppers, right? So they never completely go away. Their heyday, I would say, is from the Han, so from like the third century to the 10th century
Mhm.
or around there, right? That's when a lot of Dao had them. After that, you can still find them. They still exist all the way through, but they're not. There's other things happening and other ones taking off and becoming popular. So
Okay. And in terms of other forms of pommel, I mean, my experience, of course, is really superficial, but it seems to me like the pommel is not as prevalent or important as you see in European swords. So
yes,
do we
definitely
have
not.
example? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, yeah. So other types of pommels. The main thing is that the way that these, if we're talking like once again, these single-handed Dao with blades over 60 centimeters, then it's almost always an end cap of some kind.
Mhm.
Now, it could be um, it could be a different shape. Maybe it flares out at the end and it's kind of squarish, right? That's a style that takes off in the 17th century.
Mhm.
It could be like that. It could be rounded. It could be a ball. It could just be a like a tube on the end of the handle. It doesn't really matter. It's usually just some kind of thin-walled metal cap that sticks on the end of your handle to keep the wood from splitting, basically.
Mhm.
Usually peened. A lot of
Okay.
Chinese swords are peened, unlike Japan. So a
Yeah.
lot of Japan, the Nihonto, they like to do the bamboo pins. You can sometimes find Chinese swords with pins in different periods, but in the later periods, a lot of them are pinned. So,
Okay.
yeah.
And just now talking about pommels, going back to when you mentioned the almost rapier style double-edged sword, so long and
Yes.
used with almost with the equivalent of the dagger. Um, One difference that pops to mind is like in European rapiers, you would have the heavy-ish pommel or the hilt to kind of
Yes.
help counterbalance. Is there something similar in the Chinese ones? And if not, how
Mm,
does that influence the fight style?
yeah, yeah. So the handguard on those, the Han Dynasty Jian had very minimal handguards, and the Dao had even more minimal handguards. The Dao
Mm.
basically did not have handguards. They didn't have any
Mhm.
handguard at all, pretty much. It just handle, blade. Um, and yeah, that's
Okay.
a whole different story that I've had experience with. But the the main thing is the your weight distribution, right, is going to be different. Like there are now rapiers do not balance necessarily right at the cross guard, but many of them are
Mhm.
not too far off, right? You want
Mhm.
a little bit of weight in the blade because it actually helps you make your point movements, but sometimes the Jin will be much further out, and the Dao as
Mhm.
well. On the whole, a kind of a overgeneralization of many Chinese swords is that they will favor to have a lighter hilt, which means less overall mass, but it will mean that more of the mass moves further out into the blade, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And yeah, that obviously has some changes. As far as like how I haven't experimented too much with the Han Dynasty Jin and parrying shield combo. But
Mhm.
I think the main thing is you're going to be relying a lot on that shield to do the trapping for your work, and you won't be relying on the quillins um, to do it because you don't have them really.
Yeah.
So rather
Makes
than
sense.
try to bind on the outside and do preem or whatever, then you would have to maybe overbind or use your parrying
Mhm.
shield to do it for you, because I wouldn't want to rely too much on shedding them out with my blade. So
Yeah. Makes sense. Okay. So in terms of a general panoramic view of the weapons, would you say that kind of what we've talked about covers, let's say, the big, superficially covers, let's say, the big changes and the big. So would this be a good moment to move to the sources?
yeah, sure, yeah. I
Okay.
mean, yeah. So we've talked and we have a basic idea of the weapons. Yeah,
Yeah.
now let's talk about the sources because that's what I know more about. So,
Okay, cool. So, so after over an hour of introduction, we get into
yeah,
the
it's all good.
sources. So, in terms of a timeline or like, yeah, what is kind of the source tradition and how it
Okay, yeah.
plots out on a calendar?
Um, so technically, the first source we don't actually have access to because it's no longer extant. But there is a text called Jian Dao, or the Way of the Sword, that existed in the Han Dynasty. But we
Mhm.
have a bibliographic reference to it, but we don't know anything about it because we don't know where the text actually is or if it can ever
Mhm.
be found, which is kind of sad.
Mhm.
But theoretically, you could have you know, be practicing a HEMA equivalent, but it would date to 200 AD or something. That'd be pretty awesome. But that
Mhm.
doesn't exist. So after that, the next thing we have goes way further in time, all the way to like the 1560. So that's like a 1500-year jump.
Yeah.
But um, so the earliest stuff we have access to is 1560 with Qi Jiguang writing the Ji Xiaoxin Shu, or the new treatise on military efficiency or whatever. So Qi Jiguang was this general. Now it was during the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty initially had this hereditary military system. It doesn't work well. They have a standing army, but in the southern China, their standing army had not seen combat for a long time by the 16th century, and they were not very effective. And then there's, due to, restrictions on trade, there's a blossoming piracy problem in southern China at the time. And they like to say it's Japanese pirates. Most of the pirates are Chinese, and some of them are Korean. They definitely are in cahoots with some high-ranking Japanese lords and things. And a lot of their military supplies are from Japan, because Japan was still in the warring states at this time, and they're like full scale going into, producing weapons and things.
Yeah.
Now, so these pirates start becoming a real problem, and they start, like having massive raids, almost like, think of it kind of almost like the Vikings in a sense, where it's like they'll just show up, raid an entire town, and then leave, right? And in order to stop this problem, they send this guy to the south, Qi Guang, and what he ends up doing is like, okay, the standard military system here is completely defunct. It's not usable. I need to take peasants and recreate a new army and just beat them with people who are going to do what I say, right? And that's what he does. He's successful, and then he writes a book about how he did it, or how to do it, how you should run a military. And in this book, he talks about all kinds of details, including how he trained the soldiers to use particular weapons. And this is the context where we get our first, like, martial arts manuals, if you will, right? They're not at all the same as what's going on in Europe. It's a completely different system. It's emerging from the military context as opposed to a civilian context, right? Now, Qi Guang wasn't the first person to write about these techniques. Technically, there was another guy, Yaodao, another Ming general, who wrote down some weapon fighting stuff, like staff fighting, and just like less than a decade before Qi Guang. We don't have his original text, though. But fortunately, Qi Guang, in good Chinese historiographical fashion, just literally copy-pasted his entire text into his book. So we have
Lucky.
so that's a lot of Chinese stuff will do that. Like you'll have some military treatise, and it's just going to have like a whole bunch of entire books just copy-pasted directly into it. So that's how they preserved a lot of their written word, which is fortunate because we have a lot of old text, right? Even though it's been recopied, which is introduces other issues, but it's still something, right? So right around 1560 we get this, and then he makes another text later that talks more specifically about training troops, but he doesn't talk about the weapons. He talks more about drilling practices and things, not exactly martial techniques. And then he revises his original book after that, and then he adds the two-handed dao, so the one that was borrowed from Japan.
One question comes to mind here. It's broad and maybe outside of the purely Chinese scope, so don't feel you need to force yourself into the answer. But when we look at a lot of European treatises or traditions, there's often the question of, okay, but was this actually then used in battle? Because some of them are quite elaborate, and this instead is an actual military tradition that is being put into paper, let's say, in writing. Do you notice, let's say, simplification of the technique? Like, do you notice like something that makes it military in nature?
Yeah, definitely. I'll put it this way: it's not like Fabrice or something like that, where you have like, 100 something, more than 100 pages about how to beat this guy with the same weapon, right? You have way simplified some of the stuff. Now it even says like let's take the one I'm most familiar with is the shield manual, which is only 8 techniques. It's just eight
Okay.
techniques. It's like, and it's always against the spear. They don't even tell you how to fight anything else, right? This main shield manual that he wrote, he's like, and he even says basically, if you read his whole book, it's just like the shield guy should never actually fight the spear. You're just supposed to stay back and let your spear guy kill their spear guy. And you just protect your spear guy with your shield, right? So that's how you're really supposed to do it. But he's like, if you need to fight the spear guy, this is how you beat them, right? First, you make sure you have some good fast footwork to stay back, and you take initiative by throwing a javelin at him, so he has to react, and then you run in. And if the spear goes this way, you do this. If the spear goes that way, you do that. If it goes up, you do this. If it goes down, you do this, right? It's like this basic system.
Yeah.
But that's what it is. It's basic, right? It doesn't get into too many details. Now, the weapon, well, okay, there were 2 weapons that everybody cared about more than everything else because it's a military context. Later it becomes kind of 3, but the first one is archery. They wrote a lot more detail about archery than the other stuff. Like I've even looked into like English longbow stuff, and I think I can't remember the name of the earliest longbow text. It's a Tudor period thing, but the level of detail that we have in the Chinese stuff is like way more. It's like he even gives a breakdown like these are the different schools, this is their different posture, this is why they're wrong, this is how you should breathe when you're shooting, this is how you should look at it's like a really detailed text. Justin Ma and has done great work, and they translated the way of archery like yaodao. It's like a thing, but and you could actually argue even in the Warring States period we have a description of how to shoot a crossbow. It's like you line up the back sight with the front sight and you look at it like this and you shoot it, and you breathe, like you hold your breath or whatever. It says some of that stuff, and it's so the archery tradition as a military weapon way more important. They cared about it a lot more than playing with swords. And the other thing is the spear. The spear we have a lot more information about because it was a way more important weapon. So we don't have like a massive volume, at least in the Ming dynasty. We haven't found any massive volume about how to duel another guy with a sword that gives you 100 or 200 pages about this topic. But with the spear, we have that basically. We have a big volume, and it's like, this is how you use a spear. You can make these movements with your point, your tip, right? And these are different schools of spearmanship that exist. This is what the kind of spear they use. The flexibility of the spear matters in this way. You can use a hardwood shaft or a more whippy, longer spear. It's like all this stuff is there, right? So they really wrote a lot more about these weapons as opposed to just the swords. Which is military context.
Yeah, it fits, of course, even the European tradition. Let's say one of the first shocks people interested in swords have is, oh, that wasn't as important as you think, at least on the battlefield.
And I should say the other thing that eventually becomes important is the firearm, right? So even in whenever T.G. Guang revised his text the second time, he's like, he even excluded the archery section. He's like, just shoot guns, just do this part with the guns. He's like, just do spears and guns. And because it basically warfare in China had also evolved into kind of a pike and shot situation or similar situation. So, spears and guns, or spears and bows, right? Those were the big weapons that mattered. So
very relatable.
Yeah.
So as for further sources, let's say what I imagine they increase as time goes by.
Kind of. So this is another problem. So in the Ming Dynasty, there was a culture of these educated people who were trying to kind of put the Ming Dynasty back on its feet, and they knew that the military needed to grow and become stronger, because the Ming Dynasty was having a lot of issues in terms of military and economy and everything. And so there was a lot of people who started writing stuff about military matters, and a lot of them also just copied wholesale the Qi Ji Guang's entire text, including the smaller text within that he copied. So they would just copies and the copies, but there was also some new stuff that was always kind of being added, right? And then you also, at the same time, you have some civilians who start writing about martial arts stuff because they've seen this other military stuff, right? So the only thing is that they're not usually writing about dueling with swords, right? So the staff also becomes an important weapon. And in addition to that, we also have some stuff which is some of it's very terse, but we have stuff like double saber a little bit, but it's almost always opposing. It's almost never opposing the same weapon. It's almost always opposing either a staff or a spear or whatever. And so that kind of expands during the late Ming Dynasty. We have this kind of heyday of like writing about these things. Then the Qing come in, and the Qing have a completely different martial culture than the Han people. And they don't write the things down, really. So it kind of takes a step back again. And that's 1644 is when the Manchus officially kind of seal the deal and take over all of China, southern China and stuff. But so we don't have a whole lot of sources from right then, but we do sometimes have some stuff will pop up, right? So, and the stuff that pops up is usually, not always, but sometimes it's aware of the earlier Ming stuff. So they're still kind of writing in that tradition, right? Now, one of the main texts that I work from is actually 18th century, and the big appeal to it for me is because it explicitly talks about this sword-on-sword situation. It's like explicitly for dueling with the Dao, which is something that we don't really have earlier. It's much more. It's a lot more material on this one scenario, as opposed to like the 8 techniques or whatever for like shield against spear or something like that.
Okay, 18th century, and then as we move closer in time to, let's say, our day, what happens? How central does the sword still stay, or if central at all, let's say? Or
So, well, the thing about it is that it's no longer about the battlefield context, right? Because swords were still being used on the battlefield in the sense of like, it's your sidearm for chopping someone up or whatever. But it's this source is very much about, we both don't have armor and we just have a sword, right? And these are the different things you can try. Now there's other things about the structure of the manual that are very tricky to work with. It's not written in a very straightforward way. It's not even written well, maybe I would say, because sometimes the quality of sometimes it seems like they misspell things, and it's not just me and my Chinese ability, that's other people. Like everybody's like, what is this guy doing? But yeah, so it's not an easy text to work with, but it is about that situation, and largely just because that's a time whenever let's say you're assaulted on the street, right? You have your sidearm and you pull it out and you try to survive. right? So, and the other thing is, of course, the dangerous encounters were happening all the time through Chinese history. It's just a matter of when were people going to write them down or write anything down, right? Because the literati culture, or the culture of the educated elite who could write, they didn't really care about anything related to martial arts, like in large part due to the influence of Confucianism. So,
Okay, makes sense.
I mean, yeah, Confucius was very much against the idea that you should practice weapons, because why would you want to be violent? It's not the right way to run society, which is true. You don't want to just oppress everyone through violence, but but it does mean that we didn't get as much as we could have, right? Had there been a different path or whatever that things took. But the a lot of the educated elite for a lot of history did not want to mess with weapons, really, and they would, and even there's always a tension between the civil officials, the bureaucrats, and the military officials, because a lot of the military officials could still read and write, but they were mostly just preoccupied with running the military. And if they're writing about like commentaries on the art of war or something like that. And the civil officials were always kind of implying that they're the real ones who are like above the messiness and the nastiness of violence or whatever. And
Interesting.
so, yeah.
Which, I mean, again, falls in line with what you were talking about earlier, of like this central importance in Chinese history, at least as far as I'm understanding, of like the bureaucratic machine over the technology or specific. Interesting.
Yeah. There were, like I said, there was a couple times where this changed slightly. The Han Dynasty appears to have been a time when the educated elite who could read and write were interested in swords. That's why they wrote about them. And then the late Ming Dynasty. The late Ming Dynasty, that time whenever you have some people, some civilians who can read and write, they go and they train like Shaolin staff. They become a Shaolin staff master, and then they write about it and make a book about it, right? So there is some stuff going on then, and then with the transition with the Qing, that culture kind of vanishes. In part, perhaps it's difficult to say, but in part, perhaps because the new Manchu invaders or whatever, they would be, you don't want to be associated with anything they're associated with, right? So they're the violent barbarians. We're the refined people who aren't like that, right? So why would we write about violence?
Makes a lot of sense in the context. So you, of course, are not only a student, let's say, of the sources, or a researcher, let's say, of the sources, but you're also a practitioner of the art. So is there a continuity in the like lineage of these martial arts, or are you having to do a bit of a like philological reconstruction as has happened with Hema?
So, great question. Now, whatever I say here, some people probably won't be happy, but it's okay. I've probably already upset quite a few people because I'm speaking too generally. But the thing is, the living tradition, right, of Chinese martial arts, we can trace some things back into the Qing dynasty, right? Now, details are very difficult to pin down, and as even if, like, let's say Tai Chi, like everybody knows Tai Chi or Tai Chi, right? It's it was definitely floating around in the mid Qing dynasty, but no one was writing anything down about it really. And the people who were practicing martial arts are not they weren't usually very educated and literate. That's why they would teach people things like forms, because they couldn't always read and write.
Hmm.
And they also have something in Chinese called a kojuge, or like a rhyme song. And the rhyme song is supposed to teach you maybe principles of the martial
Hmm.
art, right? It's like a whole rhyming song that you do. And the reason that that exists is because those people couldn't read and write. If they could read and write, they just would have wrote it down, right?
Yeah.
Now, however, those kojuge, or those rhyming songs, are an interesting source in the fact that because they're rhyming, they're going to be less prone to um, word changes over time. They will still, of course, have some, but it's going to be more fixed in
Yeah.
phrasing than otherwise would be if it didn't wasn't forced into this rhyming scheme. So those are probably older things, right? If you some of those kojuga are definitely going to be dating back some, but we don't always have them written down in period, right?
Hmm.
As far as exactly how people moved, that's even more hard to pin down, and or even the names of forms. Like I've done a lot of like looking at stuff and trying to find how old I can get things to go from the living tradition back, and even the it's I've only found maybe a couple styles, even the names of a couple styles that predate 1911,
Oh,
right?
okay. Wow.
So that's like how extreme we're talking, like how hard it is to find things, let alone like techniques, like like Tai Chi Chuan. Technically, you can find some references going all the way back to the Ming Dynasty, so you can find some things which is like this is a style that exists. How much it's changed over time, we don't know because we don't have like a detailed breakdown of all the techniques.
Mm.
Um, However, there are things which appear to be have some continuity, and sometimes it's named techniques, or I guess you could call them a technique. But like in this manual that I study, this is something that's always fun about Chinese martial arts and also infuriating, is that they'll use this crazy alliterative language, or like allegorical language to describe things. So you can have like push open the window to gaze at the moon or something like
Mm.
that. It's like, what does that even mean? Like, or like the phoenix spreads its wings, or like, there's like all this other stuff. Like, what is this? And what it really is once again, I think it's a sign of an illiterate culture, or a maybe, it's always difficult. It's always rough to say someone's illiterate, because a lot of these people could maybe read like a handful of characters in the past. It wasn't
Hmm.
like there was no literacy training in the general
Hmm.
population. They could probably read like restaurant signs and things, but they were not very literate. They were definitely couldn't read the classics, right?
Yeah.
And this speaking through this allegory, it's rhyming, it's memorable, at least to them, even though to
Mm.
us it's like, what is this craziness sometimes? But it's like, um, and
Yeah,
if
and I
you,
imagine, uh, sorry, no, I imagine if that was paired with, of course, some kind of training, like if I can, like if when I'm in the time they're learning, the spreading of the wings of the phoenix
yes,
is connected to a
yeah,
movement, then of course it
yeah,
just
exactly.
means
and
something. Yeah.
and some of them do make sense. Some of them do make sense, like the spreading the wings. Like it won't always be called, like the source I have is like the cinnabar phoenix spreads its wings, right?
Mm.
And what it really is you're expanding your shoulders like this as you're reaching out to do a chop, right?
Yeah.
And it you can find in the living tradition, they won't call it the exact same thing. They won't say like cinnabar phoenix, but maybe they'll say
Mhm.
like the rock, like ROC, the great rock spreads its wings, or they'll say like whatever phoenix spreads its wings, like a different color,
Yeah.
but it'll be a similar motion, right? So this idea of like spreading wings is something that's kind of continued on from that time.
Mm.
So, or some of the techniques like don't change as much, like that first one I mentioned, Tuitron, where you like open the window to gaze at the moon, like it's this kind of like motion like this, where you put your lead hand out like this or whatever,
Yeah.
that exists in multiple styles, multiple lineages have a motion like that with a similar name, and they're always quite similar, and it exists and is referenced in the manual, right? Which dates to like 18th century. So
Yeah.
that represents some type of continuity. even
Yeah.
though basically in the history of Chinese martial arts, the whenever China became a nation state in the process of nationalization, there was a rebranding of
Mm.
what martial arts are and what they mean. Similar to how in Japan, after the Meiji, you transition from like jutsu to do, right? Like jujutsu to
Mhm.
judo or something. There's the similar element that happens in Chinese martial arts where it's no longer okay to just practice martial arts because that's for criminals and thugs. So martial
Yeah.
arts are this thing about self-cultivation, and you know it's a legitimate pursuit for middle class educated people and people who are pro nationalist. It's something that nationalists can do and feel proud of
Hmm.
the nation, right?
Yeah.
And this means that a lot of styles, some people might not like me saying this, but this in my reading, this means that a lot of styles get created and a lot of forms get made up, but they're not making it up out of nothing, right?
Yeah.
There's things that come before that there's fusing and mixing together and rebranding and reclassifying all these things that are happening. But um, yeah, so a lot of things that we see nowadays, and interestingly, if we look at like the so one important organization for this was like the Pure Martial Organization or Qing, right? So Qing was like in Shanghai in the early 20th century. They wrote down quite a few things, and we can see their forms that they wrote down, and then we can compare them to what people are practicing today, and it's
Hmm.
very similar. Like the actual form hasn't changed very much at
Mm.
all, depending on which lineage you do. So there's definitely continuity in the forms that can be passed down. Um, but as far as how early can we say they were practiced, that is the hard part, and that's the part where the sources really start to kind of fail us in
Mhm.
some way.
It's also really interesting. It seems like this kind of having these mental images that are then used across different documents or different styles really may pose an initial difficulty in kind of interpreting what that movement actually means, because Phoenix may mean a
Yes,
bunch of different
definitely.
things.
Yes,
But then
yes,
once you know it, suddenly that unlocks a whole bunch of different documents or different styles, because everyone that uses that movement seems to be adopting that visual
yeah.
image, which is very interesting, I think, in terms of from a interpretation
Yeah, and
perspective.
yeah, it is, yeah, for sure, because it means that in some sense, the interpretation of the manuals does require or is benefited by some knowledge of the living tradition. Even if
Yeah.
I do have now, not of course, there's lots of stuff in living tradition that people who are doing great things. Some of the people are amazing. A lot of the, but a lot of it is basically just dancing around, not really doing
Mm.
any fighting at all, or
Mhm.
sparring, or no level of resistance, right? And um, which means that it's kind of difficult to just say, "Oh, I'm just going to go do this, Shaolin dance routine, and then I'm going to know what they did in the past." Right? It's not. No, it's not. It doesn't work like that. But we do still, like, let's say, there's another Ming Dynasty text which talks about a two-handed Jian, which is the
Mhm.
only real Jian manual that I've found that is early at all. And one of the motions in it is 波涛寻蛇, like part the grass to seek the snake. Like you open the
Mm.
grass up to get the snake or whatever. And that's a motion. And when you read the manual, if you know the motion in the modern traditions, then it makes sense the way they describe. Like they don't give you all the details, but if you know the modern motion, you can look at what they say in the manual, and then it makes sense. Basically,
Yeah.
it's like kind of doing a parrying, deflection, or cut like this, and then you go like this, or you do this and you stab, right? So you
Mm.
cut in and then stab like this, and you parting the grass and getting the snake, right? And
Yeah.
it's living tradition knowing that benefits the interpretation of the source. So
Yeah.
even if the living tradition sometimes has nothing to do with actual fighting.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Um, in terms of timelines, the last use of weapons of like
Ah,
swords in Chinese
very good.
history,
Yes.
I know that like during the quote unquote boxer wars or rebellion,
Rebellion,
swords were
yes.
definitely a big thing.
Yeah.
Were they used later on as well, still, or?
Yes, yes, yes. But how do you say this? A lot of martial artists they have their lineage and they like to kind of big up some of their early members that they have in their lineage. Or they'd be like, this
Mm,
guy in the 1920s was like super amazing martial artist. He could beat up anybody. He like got in all these fights and like killed this guy with a sword or whatever. He's like, a lot of the time we have no verification of anything like that happening. And
mm,
when violence was really happening, even among peasant militias, there were still peasant militias and defense organizations floating around. And whenever they really had to get in any kind of fight, they were using guns. Like, let's be
okay.
honest here.
Yeah.
It's the 20th century. You're gonna shoot them. Like,
Yeah.
if you really need to kill them, you shoot them. But
Yeah.
that being said, you could still find some incidents of swords being involved, but it wasn't usually like dueling. It's not really like a fair fight, right?
Yeah. It's more.
At that point in time, like if we go back to the 18th century, if someone jumps you and you have your sword, right, you can fight them with your sword and they'll have their sword, right? So it's like
Mhm.
like not really dueling, but it's like that paired weapon situation.
Yeah.
If you go to the 20th century and someone's attacking someone with a sword, they probably don't have a sword. You're probably just butchering them.
Yeah.
Or
Exactly. Okay.
yeah. So
Yeah. So
it
there's
could
no
be
room
like
for the technique. Let's say it's more of
yeah,
a street assault or something like that.
yeah, yeah. And
Uh,
in the military though, you do have what's called the big sword units or the da dao dui, right?
mhm.
And so there was one incident whenever they were fighting some Japanese people on the Marco Polo Bridge, and they basically ran out of ammo and they had to fight with their swords, right?
Mm.
And that became a very inspiring nationalist, um, like they like movement behind them, and the
Yeah.
imagery of the sword as a symbol of resistance against Japanese imperialism was a big deal. And so you still had soldiers walking around with these swords in World War II. And whenever you get into some crazy situation, I mean, even today, every once in a while, you have some soldiers kill each other with a non-bullet, right? But
Mhm.
most of the time, it's guns, right?
Yeah.
It still can
Exactly.
happen, and it still did happen in the past, and they would still carry swords as kind of a symbol, and also if it worst comes to worst, right? But
Yeah.
in addition to that, the dao itself, that like broad two-handed cutting blade with a quite long handle, that itself was in the Chinese imagination is a projection of power in a sense because it's a big beefy weapon. It was also used for executions,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
So the executioner sword is that kind of sword, and that goes back into the Qing dynasty and it continues into the 20th century, right? So sometimes if there could be a warlord that executes somebody, they could shoot them, right? Maybe they could cut them up with the big sword, right?
Mm.
So that's kind of a darker aspect of that weapon and that
Yeah.
class of weapons. But but I mean, yeah, it's kind of a representation of like I'm the person who laid down the law, and
Yeah.
yeah, and also I
It's
resist Japanese. So,
it's a good object for that kind of symbolic role, let's say. Like it's big,
yeah,
it's easily recognizable, it's a symbol essentially of
yeah,
power, as you said.
yeah,
Um, when it comes to then modern practice of Chinese martial arts, let's say, is there something similar to what HEMA has become in the Western world? Like, is there interest in these are these schools? Like, is their discipline growing? And what's your
yeah,
insight on it?
yeah, yeah. So yes, definitely. So fortunately, in part due to the influence of HEMA, the more and more Chinese martial arts schools are taking their weapons more seriously and fencing with their swords and things like that. and there are more and more steel sparring weapons that become available, and there's increasingly more gear available that's tailored to the Chinese martial artist market, as far as like protective equipment and things like jackets that are East Asian in style, things like that. So it is growing, and that's a great thing. There's just a lot of what I know going on is mostly in North America, and I know some stuff in Australia. I'm not as in tune with everything else everywhere. In China, things are complicated, but you have the traditional martial arts world. They are primarily doing what they've always done. Now you have the Chinese HEMA community, because they're Chinese and they can read the sources. They do experiment with the Chinese sources and the Chinese weapons. Most of them will have people doing that. Some of those people also have practiced the traditional martial arts lineages and stuff. So there is some stuff going on there. But most of that is the HEMA in China is actually the HEMA world and some traditional martial arts within it, kind of moving into the Chinese weapons, as opposed to the traditional world seeing HEMA and moving in that direction.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Is that causing any kind of, because I can imagine like HEMA was able to in Europe pop in, let's say, in basically uncharted territory. There was no martial art that claimed to be, let's say, of old lineage or stuff, so they could kind of just take that place. Whereas I can imagine that for China, there, as you say, there's a lot of claims to continuity, or these martial arts that have become more movements rather than clash. Does that cause friction between the two worlds?
Well, I mean, you can always find people arguing online. That's just out of a constant of the internet itself. But the main thing is that in China, Chinese martial arts are a state-sponsored and project. And there's people who practice the traditional style, the traditional way, where it's like, I have my lineage and I pass it on to my disciples, or tools, right? And they will continue my lineage after I'm gone, right? And it's a very traditional, and it's just a very old school way to do things, right? But most people who practice like kung fu or wushu or something, it's like they're probably doing the state-sponsored formats, which would either be the forms competition or sanda, right? Now, China wants its own competitive martial arts, or its own martial arts, to be in the Olympics. They made a bid for it a few times. No one wanted to. They've got rejected on the forms competition because, well, just political reasons, I guess, right? It's always politics, but you could argue that it's too hard to judge, right? How do you judge that fairly? You could also say the same thing about rhythmic gymnastics.
Yeah.
But yeah, so wushu never got its bid to go into the Olympics, right?
Yeah.
Now, recently, in the last few years, they tried to develop a weapons format, but it's not what anybody wants. Because their goals are not, let's practice this like as if you're using a real sword in history, right? They don't really care about that. It's about what's a Chinese style thing that we can have that can be unique enough compared to other things, and also be competitive and judged in athletic activity, right? So what they've done is created this new sport of Bingdao, which is like the way of the weapon or whatever. And it's you use these foam swords, and you get more points. Like if you strike someone, you get a point. If you jump in the air and strike them, you get 2 points. If you spin and strike, you get 3 points. So you can see how that simple rule set quickly incentivizes like crazy spinning motions. And even if you get hit in the back and then you spin and hit them, you win by 2 points. right?
Yeah, of course. It almost sounds like, with a lot of huge differences, of course, but it almost sounds like um, ad hoc invention, sort of a Olympic fencing alternative, in the sense that you're completely moving into the sport, creating a whole set of rules, but without that natural evolution into the Olympic
Yes,
fencing. It's
yeah,
like,
yeah,
oh,
yeah.
let's design
And
a.
it was also, it was very intentional. It was very intentional that it was, able to be judged, and that it was not anything like Olympic fencing, and
Mhm.
also that they wanted something that their form athletes could do well,
Yeah.
right? And the forms athletes are amazing acrobats. They can do some incredibly crazy stuff that I could never do. And if you want someone to be able to jump in the air and spin and stuff like that, and it don't matter if they get hit, if as long as they hit the other guy, some of those people would be amazing at that, right?
Hmm.
Um, Now, so far, that has still been a very small project. So the thing about China and this is that these things are massive, and massive institutions uh, aren't always in agreement amongst like the whole apparatus is not always in agreement with itself, right? So I'm sure that there are um, people within the Chinese Wushu organization who are kind of wanting to incubate this project and expand it, and there are others who are like, "This is a waste of time. Let's just do this other thing instead." Right? There's always going to be those tensions within any large organization, um, but yeah, that's kind of the idea of those. That's the brainchild that those people had.
Mm.
I
Do
should
you
also say
force? Oh,
there
sorry.
are just so I'm not unfair. There are some traditional martial arts lineages in China who have started doing more weapons sparring.
Mm.
Mostly, the one that is most notable online is uh, like Ma Tongbei. So like Ma Mingda and Ma Mianchen. So this is the Ma family. They actually were trying to recreate a 1930s competitive rule set that existed that died out, which was similar to in some ways, they used bamboo swords, kind of like kendo, but it was a
Mm.
competitive Chinese fencing format that existed for a very short time and died out. And they tried to revive it, and they wanted that to be what goes to the Olympics. But the people, the Wushu organization people, didn't listen to them and created the Bing Dao instead. So
Okay, interesting. Well, I guess with the debacle of breakdancing in the last Olympics, there's a slot open because I don't think we'll be seeing breakdancing anytime soon.
I mean,
Um,
it was fun to watch.
but okay, so yeah, it seems like a lot of this. Well, do you, as a practitioner, see this potentially coming, uh, like this invented, quote unquote, again, invented sport, conflicting with, let's say, the budding HEMA, again, incorrect term, but let's say HEMA inspired environment? Or do you think there's room for the two to develop kind of in parallel
I
paths and without?
Yeah, I think there's definitely room for the two to develop in parallel because they're not even getting close to the same demographic, right?
Okay.
The the HEMA community in China is very much a lot of it's like young college kids who are interested in the European arts, and then some of them
Hmm.
also do traditional Chinese arts, and they practice the weapons as in that
Hmm.
format. Whereas the Bing Dao is I haven't met anybody who actually does it. I'll put it
Hmm.
that way. Like if it
Okay.
is being done, it's very much a part of the Wushu organization, which means that it probably, if it did explode, it would be done through like kids classes, and they would grow it up from there, basically.
Hmm.
So that's going to
And
be a completely different project,
yeah.
and I don't see them competing too much for space. And one of them will be funded by the people who do it, and one of them will be funded by the organization itself, right?
Yeah.
So
And do you think the Wushu organization would ever have interest in like embracing or taking over, depending on your point of view, I suppose, but the like HEMA side of things, because I can imagine with such a big like with the backing of such a huge organization, that would mean instant boom of something that's already gathering interest.
Yeah, no, I don't see that happening.
Okay.
Because, like I said, their goals are to get it into the Olympics, and they couldn't get historical Chinese fencing in the Olympics because it's already too similar to HEMA.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I see. Yeah.
And HEMA,
And
HEMA might make its own bid for the Olympics one day if some people have their way. I'm not
mm,
people who think that's a good idea, but yeah.
yeah, I think that would be a hotly debated topic. In terms of like when you think about HEMA, there's a few big topics that are like, oh, I don't know, the German versus Italian school or these things here. Are there some similar
Just give me one
big?
moment.
Yeah,
Just give
absolutely.
me one moment.
In the meantime, I'll take advantage to remind everyone if to subscribe to this channel, of course, if you haven't, but also Keith has his own channel, The Scholar General, where he dives much more into detail on these topics. So subscribe to his as well, if you want, of course, but I encourage you to.
All right, sorry about that.
No worries.
So I'm trying to remember the very last question you asked me. I remember I said that the majority
If there's anything similar to like the, I don't know, the style debate between German and
yes.
Italian, or some of what are
Okay.
the big hot
So,
topics?
um, n- not really with the swords, but there is some stuff with the staff and the
Mm,
spear. So, and also the connection between staff and spear. So,
mm,
some of the Chinese sources that we have, um, there's a debate about whether or not the spear can be an appropriate training implement, or the staff can be an appropriate training implement for the spear. So
okay.
one source would well, a couple sources would say like, well, the spear or the staff can serve as like a general representation of like all the other weapons. So if you learn how to use staff well, you can use almost anything well, right?
Yeah.
Which kind of makes sense, especially if it's like a cutting pole arm. The staff is going to be quite similar, right?
Yeah.
But then there's another source who jokingly, a couple of us call him like the George Silver of Chinese weapons, weapon arts or whatever. But he basically he has a big spear manual, and he does not like this idea. He completely disagrees with this in a matter of principle. And he also calls out one of the other guys for relying on strength too much for his techniques.
Mm, okay.
So it's like
You'll always
it's
find that
it's
everywhere, right?
yeah. So there is some debates about the transferability between staff and spear.
Okay.
And there are different like, and it's very difficult to say because, as I mentioned, with the modern living traditions, the modern living traditions will sometimes have different principles as far as like how you're supposed to move. And like, let's say bagua, like if you do bagua dao, for instance, it's going to be very much about circular footwork, and like
Mm,
the the ideal of bagua fundamental principle is like circle behind them and get to their back kind of idea, take an angle on them, right?
yeah.
And when they take a weapon, they keep doing the same type of footwork, and um, they emphasize that that is kind of the principle of all fighting in a sense. And other styles are not nearly as circular like that. Like Xi, sometimes people actually practice both of them, even though they're kind of like very different approaches. So Xi is much more direct in how they approach fighting,
Hmm.
and they're not always completely straight, but sometimes they'll take a slight angle into the person, right? But you're always going towards them mostly.
Yeah.
Um, and that's just a very different approach. It's all a lot of these things. It's not that you will. It's not like they're gonna move. It's not like they're gonna move a weapon that much differently, Like there are different ways you can do things. Like I mentioned, the difference between military saber and Chinese dao. You can have certain principles that you decide that have ramifications on smaller details later. But a lot of the stuff is also going to be quite similar. Like every single system that exists with a sword has a hanging parry into a cut. Almost every single one. Maybe a few rapier sources don't really care, or small sword, right? Because you don't cut with it. But like there are some fundamentals that are very common and shared, and most general motor motions are going to be shared. But there are differences in approach that lead to differences in detail of certain things.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Absolutely. So if someone wanted to get into studying Chinese sword fighting or martial arts, or just the context, are there resources you would suggest, especially for those who don't speak Chinese, I would imagine?
Yes. So that's the great barrier is the language, right? But I would say that you have a few different places. There is Scott Rodell with the Great River Taoist Center. I've studied with him some. Some of his stuff is quite good. You also have there's some Wudang Jian stuff in Seattle or in the northwestern United States, and also there's some stuff going on in Canada, and also there's there's the spear sparring sport of Da Qiang, which I didn't talk about, but that's a whole nother thing, and it's also quite cool and something worth looking into. Yeah, and there's another one. If you're more interested in very strict traditional training, then I recommend Byron Jacobs with Mushin Martial Culture. He takes a very, very old school traditional approach to Chinese martial arts, if that's what you're looking for. As far as the sources themselves, there are some online translations available. Brennan translation. And I also I translated the source that I work with, even though it's a very convoluted source and just the straight translation is very difficult. But if anyone is interested in studying it, just reach out to me, and I'm always happy to share whatever I can. So.
Cool. Which is actually a great hook to, well, I already mentioned your YouTube channel while you were off screen for a moment, but good to remind everyone it's The Scholar General on YouTube. And are there any other websites, sources, blogs you want to mention for?
Oh, let's see. Yeah, I'll go ahead and shout out a couple people.
Yours too, I mean.
Myself, yeah. So myself, I'm Scholar General. Just search it on YouTube. Look for the white bald guy talking about Chinese weapons, and they find me. In addition to that, the Wandering Warrior, Vincent Sung, he's also a good friend of mine, and he has a great channel. And as far as just swords go, if you want to learn about Chinese swords, then Sword Sage is an old school YouTuber. He has a lot of stuff on Chinese swords. I wish he'd make videos more often. But other than that, it's all good stuff. Yeah. So those are the main sources to go to. Yeah.
Okay, so we've hit the 2-hour mark, and I have the feeling that we've barely scratched the surface. But I also feel like, based on how we started the call, we've kind of covered most of But is there anything you feel we've completely missed and you want to mention, like just to give the initial context to someone?
Yeah. I would just say that, let's think. When you think of Chinese swords, really just think more, I've mentioned this before, but really just think more about relating them and comparing them to like medieval swords and maybe like early Renaissance swords, like the side sword, as opposed to comparing it to rapier and saber and small sword. There are definitely, and those things are interesting to compare, but just know that they're going to be more different. Right. So, yeah.
Okay. So for me, this was incredibly interesting and filled a lot of gaps that I felt I had whenever reading about Chinese swords. I always felt like the oddball in conversation. So I feel like now at least I go with can go in with a little bit of a background. So thank you very, very much for your time. And yeah, sorry for keeping you up.
No, you're good. One more thing, one more
Yes.
thing I'd like to say is I'm very prone to being wrong about things sometimes, about details. So, you know, always take a written, verified historical source over anything I say. And if you want to know more about anything I say, always reach out. So yeah,
That's very nice of you to mention, and it's very true probably for every single conversation or single thing someone says. So thank you for the reminder. And yeah, I'm fairly sure we'll be in touch further with more detailed
it was
topics potentially, but
yeah. Well,
thank you
I had a
for
great
your time.
conversation. It was a lot of fun. Thank
Nice.
you for having me on. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Bye, Keith. And if anyone has questions, as you mentioned, either reach out directly to him or in the comments below. They'll be answered.
Yeah. All right.
Bye.
See you later. Bye.